This podcast is brought to you by the Albany Public Library main branch and the generosity of listeners like you. What is a podcast? God, Daddy, these people talk as much as you do. Razib Khan's Unsupervised Learning.
Thanks for listening to the ungated version of the Unsupervised Learning podcast. If you want to read some essays on some of these topics, please check out razib.substack.com. Again, that's razib.substack.com. Thank you.
Hey, everybody. This is Razib with the Unsupervised Learning podcast. And I'm here with a returning guest, Dr. Francis Young. And we are going to be talking about his book, The Silence of the Gods, The Untold History of Europe's Last Pagan People. So this was kind of a solicited podcast, but you know what I'm interested in, so I jumped at it, Francis. Really quickly, can you tell the new listeners, because it's been a while, what your background is in terms of religion, history, and folklore?
So my name's Francis Young. I teach at Oxford University for its Department for Continuing Education, and I'm a historian of religion and belief. So Silence of the Gods is one of my books, which is looking at pre-Christian religion in northeastern Europe, essentially, across that whole swathe of kind of the margins of the European continent. And so I'm mainly interested in the religious history of Britain, and the Baltic region is really my kind of core interest.
Yeah, and so the Baltic region, we are talking here to give a reference for the modern people, basically northern Poland into Kaliningrad, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. The narrative in Silence of the Gods does extend, I think, a bit into Finland and definitely towards the northern Uralic region. And so, I think a lot of the listeners will have read some of my works on the Finnic people, but there is a kind of ethnographic distribution from the Eastern Baltic, from the shores of, say, Estonia, Finland, you going eastward in a band all the way to the North Urals of various, to us, obscure Finnic-speaking groups, but obviously not to the Russians. And until relatively recently, as in, let's say in the last couple of centuries, the last 500 centuries, maybe since Ivan the Terrible in the 16th century, that region was actually predominantly Finnic-speaking. And so Russification has transformed that area into something that it was, it was very different in the early modern, late medieval period, kind of when in Western Europe the Renaissance was going on. And so, just before we get into the kind of like the definitions here, because I think this book is a mix of, I think, the empirical work, obviously going through the texts and going through literature, but also kind of some theoretical framework of what you mean by paganism and Christianity and religion. But just really quickly, I think the last, so pagan Lithuania, the Grand Duchy, was the last pagan polity officially in Europe that we know of. Some of the stuff that you're talking about in the Northern Urals, though, to be honest, it makes it clear to me that this is a bit definitional. That some of these Finnic polities in the Urals were actually already relatively advanced, and maybe if they were Christian, we would call them states. But set that aside. 1387, the monarchy, the dukes convert to Christianity, Roman Catholicism, and that's the end of official paganism. In the previous podcast, we talked about how basically rural folk, peasant paganism in a way, not just like folklore, did persist for centuries, probably until the Counter-Reformation, maybe a little later. In this book, you have a much bigger ambit, and it's really interesting because we're talking like 17th century, 18th century even, and in some places there are instances of what seem to be people who don't simply have a folk religion that maybe the Christians could dismiss as superstition, but a continuous tradition of I don't want to say pagan cultic, because that that has a particular image in people's minds, but basically a continuous authentic tradition back to pre-Christian period of worshiping pagan gods, and also continuing particular rituals like around stones and woods and these sorts of things. And so we're talking, Immanuel Kant is like, walking across the bridges in Königsberg. And then you have people not that far from where he is, probably some of the last people that are still worshiping, pagan gods. Now, in the book, there is extensive discussion whether these are their ancestral gods, because they don't live in a vacuum. They're not fossils. They're interacting with the world around them. And so, can we take a step back away from the empirical? Because I want to dig into that, because I think that's what people want to know about. Talk about your definitions and your classifications here in terms of what is and isn't pagan, and how that relates to Christianity, and what medieval period people were like okay with calling Christianity versus, say, I don't know, someone in the pietistic Lutheran movement in the late 18th century.
Yeah, well, if you talk to people who come from that region, Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians, they will very often tell you, often with great pride, that their countries were among the last pagan countries in Europe. And as with all these kind of popular understandings of history, there's an element of truth there, but it's also quite a difficult term, this pagan word, to use when we apply it to this region. I think one reason is that when we use that word pagan, we are instantly evoking the Mediterranean world. Of course, pagan is a Greco-Roman term. It's a term that Christians use to describe anybody who wasn't them. It's an othering term. So it's a pejorative term. It's a term that you use for people who are not like you. Now, having said that, of course, there are people today who regard that term as a positive term and have, if you like, kind of tried to recapture it as a positive term. So it doesn't have wholly negative connotations now. And I think for me, it's not so much the negative connotations of the term which I find troubling. It's more that it's a lumping term that puts everyone together in the same category. So you can say, the Sami are pagan up in the Arctic Circle, the Finns are pagan, the Karelians are pagan, the Estonians, the Latvians, the Lithuanians, the Maris, the Chuvash, all these people who live, thousands of kilometers from one another, in this vast kind of geographical area. So I think it's kind of a lumping term, and that's why I avoid it. So the term that I tend to use, I use a variety of different terms in the book, but I use the term pre-Christian because the common shared experience that all these peoples have, whatever their differences in language, in ethnicity, in religion, they have the shared experience of encounter with Christianity. So they've got to somehow reckon with the dominance of Christianity and Christian power within their area. So pre-Christian. And I also use the term unchristianized, because unchristianized is a term that can refer to people who are totally sort of uncontacted by Christianity, but also people who are deeply, deeply influenced by Christianity, and yet they have not fully come to embrace the implications of what it means to be Christian people. So they are also unchristianized. So those are the two terms that I kind of prefer. But there are numerous terms you can use. You can talk about indigenous religion, talk about native religion, and I also talk about Creole religion. So in the period, particularly from the 16th century onwards, when we have lots of missionaries going into this area, reporting on weird things that people are doing around stones or fire or rivers or worshipping trees or whatever. And yet it seems that these practices are not really kind of rooted in the original prehistoric religions of these peoples. So it's almost as though they are practices that stand between Christianity and pre-Christian religion. And so I have used the term Creole religion to describe these kind of practices.
Yeah, and I think I think the great thing about your framework is obviously you have a particular historical empirical focus in the East Baltic, Northeast Europe, but it's easy to understand other phenomenon in the religious historical space that way. So, for example, the secret Christians of Japan, who, as most listeners know, were converted to Roman Catholicism in the late 16th century, early 17th century. Their religion was, banned, and most of the Roman Catholics in southern Japan who had converted were forcibly converted to Buddhism. But some of these villages in Kyushu Island in particular maintained their Christian tradition for I think that would be over 2 centuries until the religion was, allowed as a licit legal religion again during the Meiji Restoration. Uh, but during those 2 centuries, they had to be outwardly Buddhist because everyone was registered with the Buddhist temple, and their religion, what we would, candidly say, syncretized in many ways. And so some of them, when they came out of hiding, uh, the Roman Catholic missionaries and priests from the West, re-Catholicized them in a more Orthodox way. But some of them actually were uncomfortable with mainstream Orthodox Roman Catholicism, and they maintained their secret Christianity, which has now become a syncretized religion. That's just how it works. That people believe what they want to believe, and they're comfortable what they're comfortable with, and they don't fit into our simplistic categories. And so when you use a word like pagan, usually it's not applied to Muslims, for example, as you note in your work. But you get into these arguments about what is pagan and what isn't pagan and what counts as Christian. And some of the literature that I've read in this area actually is interesting because you have like Protestants or Western Christians perhaps referring to people that might be semi-Eastern Orthodox as pagan, or even fully Eastern Orthodox, just because in terms of sectarian divisions, they don't view that Christianity as authentic Christianity. So when you get into that game, it really gets confusing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, the other thing to note about the term pagan is that it's an exclusively European term. So we don't use that term conventionally as scholars of religion to refer to anyone beyond Europe. If you're talking, for example, about Africa, it tends to be African traditional religion. If you're talking about other areas of the world, it would be traditional religion or indigenous religion. We wouldn't use that term pagan unless we are referring to Europe, which has its own kind of ideological baggage that then comes along with it, as if pagan means someone who is almost waiting to be converted to Christianity, which is the implied inevitable fate of anyone who lives in Europe, because Europe is the Christian continent. And so there's huge amounts of ideological kind of and teleological baggage there of kind of our historical expectations. And what I love about this area of sort of northeastern Europe, these vast swathes of sparsely inhabited country, is that they defy those kind of historical expectations or historical stereotypes that we have. And it's these Finnic people who seem to cling to their own religious traditions for longer almost than anyone else.
Well, I mean, we do. Let's let's work back to the more familiar. Some of the listeners are going to know about the Mariel people who are in north central Urals. And, the stylized fact, like what you hear in the West, and, partly this is a tourism thing, is they were the last and they were the only continuous unchristianized, pagan population in Europe, and a minority of the Mari people to this day. It's like they're Shinto or something. They have an ethnic religion that's associated with their identity as Finnic people of the Uralic region, and they were not fully converted. And I think part of the issue here is and you can correct me here. I think part of the issue is when the Bolshevik Revolution happened, obviously all of the Christianizing kind of stopped. With a lot of these, in Siberia that we call shamanic peoples and whatnot, right? And so when it comes after the fall of communism, you have all these people that were only semi-Christianized at the end of the Tsarist period, and now we live in a whole different universe of what it means to be pagan, and it's kind of cool in some places to hold to the old religion. Now, when you're talking about the Lithuanians, they have a Ramuva, I think, it's still kind of reconstructed, even though Lithuania had a longer tradition of quote unquote paganism than Western Europe. But the Mari are the ones who claim, which I think can be problematized a little bit according to your book, that they never had a break. Like, this is like a continuous tradition that's gone back into antiquity. And so can you talk a little bit about the Mari and, how their religious practice is actually, their pagan religious practice is actually a little bit more complicated than they would want to present it, say, as a tourist in the outside world?
Yeah, it is a bit more complicated than that. I mean, it's kind of both true and not true that they have a a continuous tradition of pre-Christian religion. I think one reason why we might say that it is true is that if we take the word religion out of the equation and we talk about animism or an animist spirituality, I think it's quite clear that an animist strand within Maori society has been continuous, right the way going through to their first kind of encounter with Russian Orthodoxy, which happens in the 15th and 16th centuries. But in terms of whether a religion understood as something which can be reified against Christianity, in opposition to Christianity, has continuously existed, I think that's more controversial. I mean, essentially what happens in Mariel is that they do organize against Christianity, right deep into the 16th century, when they're taking on Ivan the Terrible, and there's a series of Cheremis wars which are fought between Muscovy and the Maoris, in which the Maoris are pretty successful, actually, and they even elect their own Tsar as a kind of mirror to take on the power of Muscovy. But eventually, through a series of forts which control the territory, the Muscovites gain the upper hand, and the Maoris end up fighting for the Russians. But the actual conversion takes place through the form of a wave of forced baptisms. And the Russian imperial approach was always very unsubtle, very much a violent approach, where they would send soldiers in who would forcibly baptize large groups of people. Now, of course, being forcibly baptized doesn't mean that you have any understanding of what Christianity is. It's a way of essentially changing people's tax status so that they're taxed as Russian Orthodox peasants, rather than being taxed as animists who are not Russian. And so we end up with this situation where the Maoris are, notionally Christian, but really they have no loyalty to it. But as the Russian imperial bureaucracy kind of loosens its grip towards the end of the 19th century, there is a self-conscious revival known as Kugu Sorta in Mariel, where people are saying, our religion is animist, this is our faith, we're going to do things our own way. But even then, Kugu Sorta is different from the traditional Maori religion. For example, they don't practice animal sacrifice. Worship is focused on a giant candle, which is in fact what Kugu Sorta means. It means big candle. And they also will have things like Orthodox icons, figures from Orthodox piety like the Virgin Mary will be present there. And Jesus is present as well in Kugu Sorta. So it's almost as much an unorthodox form of Christianity as it is a form of animism. But they are also venerating forest spirits and things like that, and performing these libations of grain and drink and so forth. And then in the Soviet period, I mean, you mentioned how the Christianization stops. And I think that is an important factor, actually, in parts of Russia for the survival of these animist traditions. Because if you are at risk of being persecuted for your religious beliefs, animist beliefs already have this tendency towards secrecy, a tendency towards only being passed on through oral tradition within families. They're focused on practices that take place in the household or within the village community. So it's actually easier to continue your animist traditions than it is to go to your local Orthodox church, and where you need a priest and you need, public worship, and it's something which is very easily persecuted by the Bolsheviks. But then as we get to the 1990s, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, there's another Mariel revival. And I think that's where this kind of modern tourist conception of Mariel as the last pagan country in Europe, where that comes from. So, yeah, it's a mixture. There's an element of truth. There are elements of continuity, but at the same time, there are these strong elements of revival to what's going on in Mariel today.
So the Mariel are kind of a one, I won't say extreme, but they're one end of the distribution. But from reading your book and other things that I've heard, I mean, this is a common tendency among many of these Finnic people, and it's interesting because you bring this up in the book. This is something like, some of the more extreme Protestant writers, frankly, act as if the peasant substrate of Europe, the peasant culture of Europe before the modern period, was just was an amorphous, like, pagan expanse. But in Northeastern Europe, their lived pagan traditions were obviously much more historically close to the present than, say, I don't know, in central Italy, right? And so when we're talking about Christianity and then the peasant superstitions that were occurring, stuff that was from what I can gather from your book, it's like some of the stuff that you're reading in Christian clerics, bishops in Gaul in the 6th century. Kind of are similar to what Roman Catholic bishops are writing in Lithuania in the 16th century. And so I don't want to act like a Marxist and just be like, oh, well, there's a linear progression of history and we're just looking at a different stage in history. But ethnographically, just because when the Christianization happened and the way the society was organized, it seems like what you're describing in Northeast Europe was actually very similar to what happened in late antiquity. And obviously we have like a different number of records and a different perspective, but the phenomenon exhibit a lot of similarities.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, if you look at, for example, Martin of Braga in the 6th century in Iberia, he's complaining about the fact that people are going to worship these deities on top of mountains. He complains about people worshipping household spirits and granary spirits, and we get churchmen in Gaul in the 5th and 6th centuries who are writing penitentials or lists of sins. Have you sacrificed to the spirits of the granary, and have you sacrificed at the crossroads? And it's notable that this stuff, it's not as though people are setting up an altar to Jupiter or an altar to Venus. These are not the big gods and goddesses, the big ticket items of Greco-Roman paganism. These are the lower stratum of ancient religion, the Lares and Penates, the Genii Loci, and so forth. And it seems to be a pattern which is followed throughout Europe, and we find it again in 16th century Northeastern Europe. We find constant mention of Lares and Penates. And in fact, because these characters are writing in Latin, these missionaries are writing in Latin, they're using literally these Latin terms to refer to folk belief, which makes it quite opaque sometimes to work out what they're going on about. But yeah, it's the same kind of lower level religion which has survived. And that's understandable because, of course, the official religion has long since been eliminated, the cult of the higher deities, because that's the sort of thing which can be eliminated fairly quickly, for example, by extinguishing perpetual fires. And so these kind of cultic acts, which require effort to continue, and they need to be sustained over time, or, major sacrifices that take place annually, that's something which, if you've got power, you can stop that from happening pretty easily. It's very difficult to stop someone from making offerings in a granary. It's very difficult to stop people from sacrificing in a corner of their house. And so it's that kind of low-level stuff which does continue for a very long time in Northeastern Europe.
Yeah, so I will say this is just like a speculative, but from talking to people, some of the things that you're talking about, you're writing about, and I've read about this actually in other books and other works, is when you have people that are uncatechized, poorly catechized, or there's a bureaucratic issue, and there's no priest or there's no pastor sent to an area, you have a sort of heretical Christianity or semi-paganism or whatever that emerged. But this is not an organized religion. It's not, it's not like an anti-church is immediately set up. People start out Christian, and then they're not religious professionals themselves. So, I have a lot of Christian friends. I have like one of my closest friends is a Catholic convert, and he's a very sincere Catholic, but he can tell you, yeah, like he couldn't really explain the Trinity. So it's like, imagine, and this is a person with a JD, with a law degree. So this is a college educated American telling me this. And so I feel a lot, I don't, it's like totally understandable in some of Silence of the Gods, when, in some cases, it just seems like the church didn't have the bureaucracy. It didn't have the system in place to catechize these people. And so, yeah, I mean, what were they going to believe? Like, they don't know what's going on here, right? So, and that's just normal default human state, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that we could draw the distinction here between adherence and conversion. So, these people are sometimes quite happy to adhere to Christianity. So you'll get people saying, oh, yeah, I'm definitely a Catholic. I'm definitely Orthodox. I'm definitely Lutheran. But it's a bit like saying that you're British or saying that you're American. It's more of a kind of a loyalty rather than spending every waking moment actually thinking about what it means to be a Christian or a Catholic or an Orthodox or Lutheran or whatever. And so it's although people have tied their colours to the mast, but without any need to have any understanding of what that actually entails. And I think, yeah, we again and again encounter people who have no religious understanding. And that's partly because the missionaries are going out often on a kind of yearly schedule. They'll go out when it's possible to travel, which in these regions, there's only a small window as you get closer and closer to the Arctic Circle, a small window when you can actually get out there and travel, when there's actually enough light, when it's warm enough to be able to do so. And so, for example, the Sami up in the far north of Scandinavia, who are also speakers of Finno-Ugric languages, but cut off from lots of other Finno-Ugric speakers, they are living this kind of semi-nomadic existence. They will come to these places where they will establish a kind of seasonal community, and then there might be a missionary there who will preach to them. They might get church services at that time of year, but then they will scatter, go their separate ways, and take with them their own ideas about what they might have been taught.
Can you talk really quickly about, you have like different estimates for different regions. And I know, and in terms of like kind of like rubbing it in the face of Europeans, like, just traditional, mainland continental, you allude to, I mean, you don't talk about it very much, but the 30 Years' War, Gustavus Adolphus, and, later after his death, Axel Oxenstierna, the Swedes are in Central Europe, and they have the Finnic speaking areas of Sweden, which became modern Finland, actually contributed disproportionately to the martial levies that went into Germany. And so you have these Finnish-speaking people that are now in central Germany encountering a landscape of Protestant Catholic warfare, but they themselves are maybe nominally Lutheran, but they're culturally very different. And like, these are, I've read this actually in other instances where, Finnic soldiers were accused of witchcraft or like weird behavior that the local Germans like, what is going on here? Like, who are these people and what are they doing? Because the Swedes knew who they were, but for the Germans, they were totally alien. Can you talk about, the Finns and the Finnic people and, how pagan they remained?
So Finland is in a strange position because it's unclear exactly when it's converted. And we just have this rather unreliable story about an English bishop called Henry. We don't know who he is, who goes to Finland at some point in the 13th century and gets his head chopped off by someone called Lally. But it sounds more like a fairy tale than anything else. And we do have a lot of reports from Finland of these pre-Christian practices. And yeah, the armies of Sweden, you've got some Lapps who are fighting in that army and a lot of Finns. And one of the accusations that is made by the enemies of Sweden is that Sweden has been so successful in its period as a great power in the 17th century because it's relying on Sami witchcraft. And this is the myth of Lapp witchcraft, which goes way back to the early Middle Ages, the idea that the Sami are skilled in sorcery and in killing their enemies at a distance. And this is quite a serious matter for a Christian kingdom, which prides itself on its godly Lutheran identity. So it's absolutely no joke to the Swedes that they're having these accusations thrown around. And in fact, it's the reason why Magnus de la Gardie, who is the sort of the chancellor of Sweden, commissions a guy called Johannes Schäferus, who's a German scholar who's come to settle in Sweden, to write an ethnographic book about the Lapps to kind of give the truth about Lapland, rather than all these kind of folkloric rumors that are spreading about witchcraft in Lapland and Lap witches in the Swedish army. So although the numbers of these people are absolutely tiny, there really aren't many people living in Lapland. It's a very, very sparsely inhabited area. Yet their political importance for the Swedish realm is actually quite significant.
Well, I mean, I think that's a good segue to talk about the Lapps, to talk about the Sami, who, you know, we call them Lapps, we call them Sami. They occupy this vast area in the north, reindeer herders. They obviously have cultural similarities, but one thing that I think I want you to reiterate is they're actually a bunch of different people, a bunch of different tribes that speak mutually unintelligible languages, right?
Yeah, that's right. So there's about 10 Sami languages. I say about 10 because it's unclear whether some of these languages still exist. That's because the Sami area of occupation is spread across 4 different countries. So you've got across Norway, so the Finnmark region of Norway, northern Sweden next to that. Then moving across further to the east, you've got northern Finland, and then you've got a whole swathe of that far northern area of Russia around the White Sea. So the Russian side of things, there are some Sami groups there. We don't know whether they still speak Sami, speak their own version of the language. But yeah, I mean, there is no such thing as a single Sami language. And the reason for that is that the Sami live in these isolated reindeer herding communities, which will settle seasonally, but then will disperse. And therefore, there isn't much pressure. There isn't much kind of a motor of centralization towards a language becoming standardized, because these people are living such kind of separate lives in different regions.
And so, I guess one of the questions that I have, so, we're talking about religion, and, you mentioned the drums. I've heard about the drums, so the Samis, they do drumming. Is it a form of remembrance or mourning?
Well, essentially, there's 2 kinds of drumming. So the drum can have a kind of musical ritual function, as you mentioned. But perhaps what's more famous than that is the idea of the rune drum or the divination drum. And that's the idea that an object will be placed on top of a drum, which has certain figures that have been drawn along it in lines. And then as the drum vibrates, as the drum is beaten, the object that is on the drum, whether that be a stone or something else, will move into a segment of the drum, and that is a form of divination of the future. So these rune drums belong to somebody called a Noaidi. Now, Noaidi is a Sami term which is usually translated in Western literature as a shaman. Whenever we use this term shaman, it's got certain connotations. The term originally comes from Siberia, from that early kind of 19th century ethnographic research into what was going on in Siberia. And of course, we have similar practices of trance visions and dream quests and so forth from North America. So shamanism is often seen as not so much a European or Eurasian or North American phenomenon, but as a sort of circumpolar phenomenon. So if we kind of shift our perspective and we look in terms of the circumpolar region, crossing continents as having certain religious similarities, that can be helpful rather than seeing this as in any way part of European religion, which really it isn't, because you don't find that kind of shamanic practice, or at least not in any kind of uncontroversial way, outside of that circumpolar Arctic region.
Yeah, this is again goes to the fact that the term paganism brackets a huge range of practices, traditions, social historical lineages, and kind of masks the structure within it. So let's talk about. I think one of the things that I tweeted this out. I put this on social media, or I X'd it out, Z'd it out, whatever they call it. So a recent president of, I think, Latvia, identified as a pagan. And so, these 3 different Baltic nations, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, kind of seem to have different relationships to their customary traditional religion, which is like, so for example, what I mean here is like, in Denmark, the customary religion is now Lutheranism since the 16th century, right? To be Danish to some extent is to be Lutheran. Now, that's not totally true anymore insofar as there are converts to other religions. I know people from Scandinavia who convert to Catholicism or who are evangelical, non-denominational Protestants. But the default is to be Lutheran. And if you're not religious, you may still be enrolled in the church or have an association with the church for daycare and other sorts of things. That's just not a big deal. So in Lithuania, it's Roman Catholicism. And because of the history of German and Swedish, Northern German and Swedish rule and domination of Estonia and Latvia, it's Lutheranism. But if you look at the statistics of the religions in these different nations and who goes to church and what their beliefs are, there's a wide range. And can you talk a little bit about that and the historical background? Because you added a lot of detail, I think, to patterns that people can just see looking at the data even today.
Yeah, there are very different relationships, I think, with, if you like, the customary Christianity, which I think is a good term to use for a lot of European countries, in that people are not necessarily very religious, they're not necessarily very observant, they're not necessarily going to church, but they might identify in a kind of socio-cultural way with a particular religious denomination. And that's weaker, really, in Latvia and Estonia compared to how it is in Lithuania. So Lithuania, for historical reasons, has a very strong socio-cultural identification with Roman Catholicism, and that remains true today. You'll get things like an inauguration mass, when there's a new president of Lithuania, he's expected to go to mass in Vilnius Cathedral and so forth, even though it's nominally a secular state. The church still has a great deal of influence, and you can see that in the way that they respond to their neo-pagan community. So Romava is the Lithuanian neo-paganism. It's pretty marginal in terms of the actual numbers of people who are adherents of it. But Romava only recently, I think it was in December 2024, they managed to attain the status of a recognized religion, which can do things like perform legal marriages and have registered places of worship. And the Lithuanian parliament only did that after essentially complaints and constant sort of encouragement from the European Court of Human Rights, because the Parliament was very reluctant to do that. And I think that reflects a kind of residual attachment to Roman Catholicism and an awareness of anything else. But in the situation in Latvia and Estonia is very different. So Latvia recently, not only did it recognize the Dievturi religion as being a legally recognized religion, but it actually passed a law which praises the Dievturi religion as embodying the best of Latvian values and the values of the state and so forth, which probably comes closer than any European country has ever come in modern times to recognizing a neo-pagan religion as a sort of religion of the state, or one of the religions of the state. And I think because Latvia has a rather looser religious identity. So some people in Latvia are Lutheran nominally, some are nominally Orthodox, some are nominally Catholic. There isn't one predominant form of Christianity. That makes it easier for people in Latvia to say, well, actually, I identify with Dievturi. I'm pagan, as you saw with the case of a president who identified himself as pagan. And it's the same in Estonia. Some Lutheran, some Orthodox, but probably the most secular of all the Baltic states. And so again, to identify yourself as pagan seems to be fairly acceptable in Estonia. And I think, in fact, paganism is the second most identified with religion in Estonia. And the only other European country where that's true today is Iceland, where it's the second most identified with of religions. So yeah, the religious makeup of a country, I think, has a huge influence on how acceptable it is to kind of identify yourself with these alternative religious traditions. But having said that, I mean, all of these religious traditions are revivals, so that they can't be said in any meaningful way to be continuities with the pagan past.
But in some ways, the distance of the pagan past, I guess it's less distance in time, because some of that is a little difficult to discern because, obviously we have like Christian perspective and the official Christianizations are in these dates and that date. But from what I can gather, part of the issue here is, Estonia and Latvia were ruled by the ruling families to a great extent were German speaking, ethnically German, whereas the peasantry was not German. And from just like reading your book, but I mean this makes sense. Part of the issue here is that the ethnicity that brought Christianity and the new Christian denominations, and I mean presumably staffed a lot of the churches, was different than of the majority of the people. And so there wasn't, in Lithuania, even though that they were highly Polonized, as in terms of the Lithuanian Polish, Commonwealth, they assimilated the Lithuanian noble elite, assimilated a lot of Polish, cultural traits, but they knew that they were Lithuanian by origin, right? So the Lithuanians were ruled by people of Lithuanian origin, whereas in Estonia and Latvia, you had foreigners rule them who were bringing this religion. And so it was always seen as different from their own traditions.
Yes, that's absolutely right. It's the fact that in Lithuania, if you've got pagans, if you've got people who are practicing pre-Christian cults, they are not in any way ethnically different from the Christian nobility, landowners, clergy, who are trying to bring them on side and make them Christian. Whereas the situation we've got in Latvia and Estonia, or we could talk about Livonia, which of course is the old term for both of those countries rolled together, that whole kind of Eastern Baltic littoral north of Lithuania, they are ruled first of all by Catholic German-speaking Catholics in the form of the military orders, the Teutonic Knights or the Livonian Sword Brethren. Then they are ruled by a Lutheran German-speaking aristocracy who are largely descended from those Teutonic Knights who've sort of Protestantized. And then, of course, we get the Orthodox Russians who come in and rule them. In the time of Peter the Great, you've got that conquest of Livonia. The rulers and those who are trying to impose an alternative religion on you are always foreigners. And therefore, there is a sense in which identification with your Estonian or with your Latvian identity almost entails, by necessity, a hostility to Christianity. And so you will get these events like the St. George's Day uprising in 1343 in the Middle Ages, where the Estonians do consciously make an attempt to kind of kill all the Christians and overthrow Christian power in Estonia. And, as late as the 18th century, you've got peasants who will refuse to take part in the rites of the church, or if they do take part, they will do so in a very deviant way. Like they will take away the consecrated host from the church, and they will do, strange, superstitious things with it, or they will worship it in a little shrine in their own house. And, they prefer to do that than to actually go to church, where very often the preaching is in German anyway. So there's this sense that, what are you going to learn even if you do go to church?
Yeah, that's a very fair point. And you also mentioned that in early modern Estonia, I think early modern, you can correct me on the exact date, it seems like the Estonians, like many small scale societies that a cultural anthropologist would visit, didn't have a taboo around sexual relations before marriage, which obviously was honored in the breach, was violated a lot throughout, according to the preachers, but I think common sense and human nature was violated a lot in reality. But people understood that it was a violation of a norm. And when you were writing about Estonia, you said they didn't even have that norm, which indicates the very, very superficial level of Christianization.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I use this example is that sometimes the depth of a society's Christianization is not measured in terms of church attendance or in terms of overt kind of loyalty towards Christian dogmas or anything like that. But in a more fundamental way, it's reflected by the extent to which that society shares the same common values as the rest of Christendom. And as you say, I mean, something like sexual morality is often more honored in the breach than the observance. But the point is that societies, even at the lower level, in theory, do enforce taboos against premarital sex or adultery and things like that. Whereas it does seem that in Estonia, not only do those taboos go unenforced, but they actually don't seem to really exist. So there's an ethnographer, a German ethnographer, living in Estonia in the late 18th century, von Hüppel, and he notes how the Estonian peasantry have no taboos whatsoever when it comes to premarital sex between Estonian men and women, unmarried Estonian men and women, that they can sleep with whoever they want at any time. However, the taboos are located elsewhere. So there are taboos against sexual relations between Estonians, ethnic Estonians, and Russians, or ethnic Estonians and Germans, and that is considered to be totally unacceptable, and you'd be disowned by your family if you do that. And in fact, what marks the beginning of marriage, as far as the Estonians is concerned, is not actually sexual relations themselves, but pregnancy. So if a woman becomes pregnant, then she will be considered to be married to the man that she is with at that given time. And there aren't really any parallels with that in any other European society in that period that I'm aware of. So that indicates that you are dealing with a society where, the kind of the values and the moral norms are rather different from those influenced by Christianity.
Yeah, I wanted to bring that up because it was very striking, because this is the kind of thing, I mean, marriage starts when, the woman gets, the girl or the woman gets pregnant. This is the kind of thing you read in anthropology books about, I don't know, Papua New Guinea or Amazonia. And I'm not like, casting aspersions on Papuans or Amazonians, but they don't have the same structure and norms with a particular historical understanding that occurred in Europe and much of the rest of the world. Actually, this is like a common taboo, and I think it just happens in certain types of societies with certain levels of social organization or complexity. We don't need to get into the details of that, but it was just interesting to note that here in the Northeast Baltic, you have behavior in the ethnographic record that in other contexts would be, this is an indigenous society, that's pre-state or something.
Yeah, that's right. And there is an active debate in Estonia at the moment about whether Estonians should consider themselves to be an indigenous people. At the moment, the only people in Europe who are considered to be an indigenous people by the United Nations are the Sami. However, the Estonians say, well, we have an equal claim to be considered indigenous on the basis that we've always inhabited this land. We were the first people to be here. And therefore, why aren't we considered indigenous? And so there are all sorts of debates in Estonia about, do you have to practice a form of life, a lifestyle, which is radically different from that of most settled urban people or settled agrarian people to be considered indigenous? Is the only reason that we consider the Sami to be indigenous because they practice this very unusual form of life based on reindeer herding, albeit today they will as often do that with a helicopter as they will, in the traditional manner. But nevertheless, their economy is still based on reindeer herding to a large extent. So can the Estonians be considered indigenous? Or you'll get people who say, well, actually, it would be harmful to start making claims of indigeneity if you're a settled urban agrarian people, because that could be, harnessed by the far right, or is politically toxic in some way. So it's quite tricky, because the Estonians, yes, they have this kind of extraordinary history of kind of permanence in that area, and yet from the point of view of sophistication of their current culture, the Estonians have a reputation of being terminally online, one of the most terminally online of all European peoples, and introduce things like digital citizenship, the first country to do that. And have lots of kind of, new companies which are promoting various kinds of digital ventures. So, yeah, Estonia has this kind of schizophrenic relationship with its own history in that regard.
Yeah. So I guess, as we're closing out the discussion, I do want to talk about, Silence of the Gods. You guys should check out the book. It's very, I don't know. I thought it was a quick read, but I might have like a little bit more background in this topic than most people. But it was a pretty quick read. It was great. One of the things that some conservative Christians, they write about, and people who actually believe that the gods, just like in your book, pre-modern Christian priests believe that, the pagan gods were actually demons who were deceiving, and this is a common idea of the church fathers, that were deceiving, deceiving people into believing that they were gods. And so, we have places like Estonia, Latvia, where, obviously even Lithuania, Ramova is pretty marginal, but still there. And, it's reconstructed as well. Like, I keep track of Ramova a little bit out of curiosity, and they have like Hindu Brahmins visit and like try to like synthesize, which is like, I get what they're doing, but like that indicates that they lost a lot of their own traditions if they have to borrow from other traditions. But you have a return of paganism in Europe in an explicit way, even if it's reconstructed. It's still there, and I guess one of the issues that reformed missiologists and scholars have always said is like Europe was it was always really pagan, because I think basically they would not say that a place is Christian or someone is Christian, and it's like until it's like all Calvinist, which, okay, then by definition you have just removed most of Europe from Christianity. But like let's set that extremism aside. We are in a new situation where Europe is associated with Christianity historically. The Rome, there's Rome, there's Constantinople. Obviously, the Protestant Reformation began in Northern Europe, and now Pentecostalism and various sorts of evangelical Protestantism all over places like Africa and South Korea. This is a continent associated with Christianity, even though Christianity emerged in Palestine. But now you have a very secular continent. But secularism and de-Christianization doesn't always mean just becoming an atheist. It means a lot of people, they create their own religious identity in an individual way. This could be like spiritualism, New Age, but also, a lot of these European societies, not all of them, but a lot of these European societies, they have enough, historical, cultural, in the case of Greeks, they have textual memory. I mean, there is a Greek neo-pagan movement, and obviously they're totally cut off from their past in a way that Estonians aren't, but we have enormous number of textual records of Greek paganism. So they can do their recreations in a very authentic way just because of that. Estonians don't have that, I think. What they have is, probably there was continuous pagan tradition in Estonia even a couple of centuries ago. So the folklore presumably is closer to the source, right? And so I threw a lot out there at you, but where are we in Europe going forward in terms of the religious culture and the evolution of the way people view spirituality? Because I don't think that it's going to be a situation where 80 to 90% of people are atheists. That just has never really occurred in any society. Most people quote unquote believe in something. So what do they believe? Like, what's going on here?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting when we look to the future of European religion. I don't think that there's much prospect of people becoming adherents of these pagan or neo-pagan religions in huge numbers. But I don't think that that's how those religions work anyway. They're not proselytizing religions in the same way that Christianity and Islam are, for example. Their success is measured by their influence on the cultural conversation in the country. And I think when we look at a religion like Dievturība in Latvia, it's got pretty small numbers of adherents. So, you're looking at about 70,000 people or something. But the influence that it has in setting the conversation about Latvian national identity, that's where its power lies. And so you find the same kind of thing actually in neo-paganism in the UK. You'll find that the actual number of initiated Gardnerian Wiccans, for example, is a very small number of people. And yet there's a vast penumbra of people whose spirituality now is rooted in some way in contemporary paganism. They might identify as hedge witches, or they might identify with Wicca in some kind of vague way without having been initiated, or they've self-initiated or something like that. And I think that that's that's the key transition, is that we've moved to a point where your spirituality can now be inspired by these revived traditions. Because some of these revived traditions are now very old. I mean, Dievturība is 100 years old this year. Gardnerian Wicca dates back to the 1940s. These are no longer kind of flash in the pan, sudden, very recent, very new traditions that, we should be making fun of or looking down on. I think that point has passed. They are, now quite well established. And I think rather in the same way that you'll get a lot of people in the Western world who will draw their spirituality from Buddhism, but are in no way Buddhists and wouldn't see themselves as being Buddhists, so you will get a lot of people now who will draw their religious influence or their spiritual influences from paganism, but without in any way saying, I am a pagan, or signing on the dotted line, or writing that on the census, as we have in the UK. We have a census which asks for your religious affiliation. And very, very few people still say pagan. But I think that that's not the point. The point is, it's that broader kind of influence, it's that broader penumbra of people who feel a loyalty to it. And that's going to be stronger in countries like Latvia and Estonia. And I think the reason it's getting stronger is that those countries are experiencing mass migration for the first time. And one response to that is to double down on your national distinctive traditions. And the ultimate way to double down on those kind of national distinctive traditions, going beyond mere political nationalism, is to engage in a kind of religious nationalism where you're saying, we are totally different, we are totally unique, not just culturally, not just linguistically, but also religiously. So having your own native faith in that respect is seen as an asset.
Yeah, one thing as you were talking, one thing I was thinking is 25% of Americans now. This is a regular result for like the whole time I've been an adult. 25% of Americans believe in reincarnation or some form of reincarnation. Obviously, 25% of Americans are not Buddhist or Hindu. I know that there are some Celtic groups that also believe in reincarnation, but I think we can dismiss that's continuity from that, But the point here is explicitly, clearly non-Christian beliefs have widespread traction in the United States, which is a much more, confessionally religious country, if not like obviously officially, we don't have an official religion, but the hold of Christianity in our society, even though it's like decreased a lot in my lifetime, is still much stronger than in a place like Estonia. But even here, beliefs that are we can put under the label pagan, non-Christian, non-monotheistic, have had a purchase. And I think part of what's looming over our discussion here is we obviously need to call something, pagan or Estonian, tribal religion or customary religion or traditional religion or whatever word. But, in the United States, we have groups like Asatru, who are trying to revive Norse paganism. And, one of the things that I think Asatru people have to, I think Steve McNally, the founder of the movement in the United States, he lives in Northern California. And so, it's a beautiful environment and a beautiful culture there. But it's a very different environment and culture from, Scandinavia over 1,000 years ago. And, and like I think Steve McNally does believe in the gods in some way. But the point is, this is like a very different environment and a very different world. And their understanding of what religion is and what religiosity is very different than it was like 1,000 years ago. So for example, just to give a concrete, there's Asatru is always riven in the United States by whether they should allow people outside of a particular ethnicity join. Okay, this was not a concern for Scandinavian pagans. They probably, and in fact, we have enough DNA evidence to know there were some random non-Europeans, very low number. I don't want to exaggerate it like some people have, but there were non-Europeans. We just know because their DNA was randomly preserved in some burial somewhere. They weren't cremated. And so, I mean, I'm sure that their descendants just became pagan. Like, it wasn't a big controversy, right? They didn't think in terms of our categories. And so, as people are reading the book, your book, I think they have to recall that, these are the mindsets of a people that don't live in our, cultural, social, technological milieu. And as people are reconstructing a religion and giving it a label and saying, like, this is the religion of our ancestors, your ancestors did not have headphones. They were not on the internet. You know what I'm saying? It's like, I guess where I'm getting at is like, okay, like, do you really need to, yes, your ancestors like put a libation over a rock, but libations and, they were farmers, they were pastoralists. These sorts of things make sense in that environment. And so people are trying to resurrect this because that's natural and it's customary and it's traditional. But, a lot of these people, they spend most of their day on a computer,
Yeah.
maybe the animism should be, I don't know. GPU gods. You know what I'm trying to get at here, right? Like, just like when I read this sort of stuff,
Yeah. Well, I mean, there are various strands of kind of techno-animism that are emerging, but I think in Europe, in countries which still have a fairly mono-ethnic identity, like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, it's less of an issue because you can say, oh, our native faith movement represents the entire nation, even though we've only got, 2,000 people who are turning up to rituals and so forth, because we embody the kind of the ancestral tradition. And it is meaningful in those countries to talk about an ancestral tradition. But if you move to the UK, you start talking about ancestral traditions, people will look at you funny because, what does that mean? Some parts of the UK, it's more meaningful than others. If you're in Wales, for example, you might be able to identify much more strongly with a Welsh identity. But, England has such a kind of dispersed ethnic identity now, and America even more so. And I think our ancestors would struggle to understand a society which has a shared concept of civic citizenship. And yet within that, you can choose to identify yourself as someone of Irish heritage or someone of Indian heritage or someone of Baltic heritage or someone of Slavic heritage or whatever, or even, potentially without having any lineage of that kind, say, well, I'm a Satru because I identify with that Norse heathen heritage. I don't know whether I am or not, but I'm going to go for it, and that's going to be my adopted identity. And that is something very, very modern.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one last thing, just like triggered by what you were saying, is just I had a funny thought. So my children, they obviously, like, my family's from Bangladesh, so that, Bengali Muslims, they have that. But on their mother's side, they're Norwegian and German mostly. And so, like, okay, how would that work? Like, if you think like your ethnic identity and your religion, like what sort of synthesis of like, Germanic paganism and Islam and more recently Hinduism, would they create? I think we live in interesting times. I think an ethnographer, if there are any, the AI ethnographers 5 centuries from now, will have a field day because they'll have a lot of text, a lot of documentation. It's all on the message boards. It's all on the Discord servers that'll be archived. And this is going to be interesting this century. We're probably not going to live to see 2100, but we've been talking about the early modern period and all this, but we probably live in a time that's as religiously active and innovative as any. And so, we here are kind of talking about the past as if it's, oh, these exotic, amazing people. And yet in the future, people will probably look at our time with all the migrations and the movements and the internet, putting everyone together in this like huge blob. Because a lot of this stuff with neo-paganism, which is not the point of this podcast, a lot of it is just people finding themselves on the internet and creating these new identities and new religions and saying, like, this is my religion. And then you have like people in England, you have people in East Anglia who are like, oh, I'm a Druid now, and it's like, well, is that technically okay? Whatever, because we don't even know a lot of what the Druidic, like, Celtic practices were, like some of it, frankly, is just made up by people. It's it's I don't take it like super seriously, but it is fascinating. You know what I'm saying? I think it's great that you're covering this, Francis. People should follow you on social media too. You have some great tweets, some great books out there, and thank you for being on the podcast and enlightening us about what some people would say was the dark time before Christianity. But there's a lot going on, and there's a lot of records because it was on the frontier. And I really enjoyed reading the book, as I said, and I hope other people will too.
Thank you so much.
This podcast for kids